Policy paralysis, lack of reforms, a string of scams, a number of questions being raised on India's regulatory environment. To add to it, a World Bank study yet again flagging off the poor business environment in the country. It's in this backdrop that the government has roped in top corporate honchos and government representatives to set up a 21-member panel that will suggest ways of reforming the environment for doing business in India. You're watching We Mean Business. I'm Shweta Rajpal Kohli. On the show today, we're discussing what exactly ails India's regulatory environment and how quickly and effectively can it be reformed. Let me introduce our guests on the show today. We've got Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta, Chairman of Shell Group of Companies, with us on the show. Also with me here in the Delhi studio, Mr. Nripendra Mishra, former Chairman of TRAI, Mr. Dhanendra Kumar, former Chairman of the Competition Commission of India, Mr. Vinayak Chatterjee, Chairman of Feedback Infrastructure. Also joining us, Mr. Mohan Guruswamy, Distinguished Fellow of the Observer Research Foundation. Thank you all for being with us here on the show. Before we really start the discussion, let's take a look at some of those major developments that have taken place with regard to concerns being raised over India's regulatory environment. The government has set up a 21-member panel that will suggest changes in India's regulatory framework. The new panel is headed by former SEBI Chairman M. Damodaran, and the other members include Vaisi Deveshwar, K.V. Kamath, K.M. Birla, Anand Mahindra. The committee will submit its report within 6 months of holding its first meeting. Of course, plenty of others on that panel as well. All of this happening in the backdrop of a lot of criticism that we're seeing of India's regulatory environment, as well as the difficulty of doing business in India. A World Bank report has ranked India last among the BRIC nations for ease of doing business. India has been ranked 134 in the World Bank's annual report, Doing Business. The ranking, remember, indicates a country's regulations and procedures for businesses. And India, in fact, lags behind Nigeria, Ethiopia, Bangladesh and Pakistan. All of those fare better than India, standing India at 134 among the 183 companies that have been studied by World Bank. And remember, India ranks lowest when it comes to ease of getting construction permits as well as enforcing contracts. Let's start this discussion in this backdrop and try and understand what's really going on and can we change things all that quickly. Mr. Vikram Mehta, let me start by asking you, these are clearly statistics that we can't be proud of. At the same time, all of this happening in the backdrop of the kind of policy paralysis, the policy instability that we seem to be seeing. Has regulatory risk and regulatory worries really increased over the last couple of years?
I think the regulator has three functions. The regulator is required to ensure that the producer of any product is able to operate on a level playing field. It is able to secure the approvals expeditiously. The regulator is also required to provide a forum for the consumer in the event of price gouging or price discrimination. And finally, the regulator is required to ensure that the government objectives, whether it be for the protection of the environment, whether it be for ensuring the highest of technical and safety standards, is also met. So the regulator's role is to balance the interests of these three different stakeholders. The problem that I find with our regulator is that they are more often than not an appendage of the government. They're not autonomous. They are paid for by the government. Most of the regulators are either former government officials or, indeed, in the case of the petroleum sector, secondees from existing government entities. And this does, to some extent, hinder their independence. And this is the first fundamental flaw in the way we operate. I think the second cause of concern is that the regulatory environment, or the regulator, needs to have knowledge of the business that it wants to regulate. And many of the areas are actually very technical. They are not able somehow or the other to acquire the domain knowledge that is necessary, and in particular the nuanced knowledge that is necessary to regulate this. So the combination of being, in a sense, part of the government setup, which biases their view, and the lack of domain knowledge is one reason why regulatory risk in this country has indeed increased over the past few years.
All right, interesting points that Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta has raised there, and who better than our esteemed panel to answer all of that. Sir, let me start by asking you at least specifically about the nature of India's regulators, the main point that Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta has raised there.
So I entirely agree with Mr. Mehta when he has defined that what are the functions of the regulator. But when we interpret this in the Indian context, we must recognize that in India, regulator is not just the one who has been created by some statutory passage of the Act. If you even today see the distribution of functions, powers and functions of the government and the connected regulator.
India's #1 news app just got even better. Download NDTV's new app, fully optimized for retina display, full screen view, faster response time, and Sudoku. NDTV's new iPad app. Download now.